Imagine waking up one day to find your entire life was a lie. Not just a bad relationship or a missed opportunity, but meticulously constructed deception. A betrayal so deep it unraveled every single truth you held dear. That's what happened to me. 7 months ago, my world collapsed. I had a marriage, a job, and a best friend I trusted with my life. Then in a heartbeat, it was all gone. My husband, Justin, had been sleeping with my best friend, Natalie, for who knows how long. When I caught them, everything fell apart so fast it felt almost coordinated. My job? Gone in 2 weeks. My divorce? It left me with absolutely nothing. Friends stopped returning my calls. I plummeted from middle-class stability to rock bottom in less than 2 months. I was living out of a dingy motel room, the kind that charged by the week, eating instant ramen because that's all I could afford. My bed squeaked with every tiny movement, a constant reminder of how precarious my new life was. That's when I saw it. An old, dusty suitcase tucked away under the bed. Brown leather, brass corners, and a luggage tag with my full name, written in a familiar, precise hand. Aunt Helen's hand. She died 9 months earlier, the eccentric family member everyone had called difficult and paranoid. I pulled the suitcase out. Taped to the bottom, a tiny key. My hand was shaking as I unlocked it. Inside, $7,000 in cash, a flight ticket to Portland, and a note. A note that didn't just rewrite my life story, it obliterated it. It warned me not to trust Justin or Natalie. It said they'd been planning my destruction since before my wedding. And then, the words that made my blood run cold. Your mother's death 6 years ago wasn't an accident. The note directed me to an address in Portland, where the real fortune was waiting, ending with a chilling instruction. Finish what your mother had started before they silenced her. Helen had spent her final years collecting evidence, while everyone, including me, called her crazy. Now, from beyond the grave, she was offering me a choice. Take the money and disappear, or use it to fight back against the people who had destroyed everything I held sacred. Before everything shattered, my life looked so normal. Safe. I had a 2-bedroom apartment, a decent neighborhood where Mrs. Chin always smiled, and a maintenance guy who actually showed up. It wasn't fancy. The walls were thin, the carpet stained, but Justin and I had painted the living room together. We'd hung wedding photos where the afternoon light made everything feel warm, even when it wasn't. I worked as a marketing coordinator at Brennan & Associates. Not my dream job, but paid the bills. $48,000 a year plus benefits. Enough for my half of the rent, groceries, and the occasional dinner out when Justin and I wanted to pretend we had more disposable income. My boss, Marcus Brennan, was professional but distant. The kind who'd compliment your work, but never promote you. Ask about your weekend, but never really listen. I'd been there for years, consistently reliable, always praised, never advanced. But I didn't question it. I showed up, made coffee, sat at my desk, and did my job. It felt stable, predictable, safe. Justin was a business consultant, or so he said. His schedule was always irregular. Late nights, weekend trips, odd-hour conference calls. He'd come home exhausted, kiss my forehead, and fall asleep on the couch with his laptop still open. I'd cover him with a blanket, a strange mix of affection and loneliness churning inside me. Proud of how hard he worked, but resenting how little time we actually spent together. We met 7 years ago at a dinner party, or so I believed. He was charming that night, listening intently, making clever jokes, offering to help clean up. Our courtship felt natural, easy, like we were made for each other. He proposed after 18 months in the same park where we'd had our third date. I said yes without a second thought. Why would I say no? But things shifted subtly over the last 2 years. Justin became so protective of his phone, tilting the screen away, taking calls in other rooms, face down during dinner. He got vague about work. He picked fights over the smallest things. The dishwasher, organic vegetables, how much time I spent with Natalie. Natalie, my best friend since college. We'd been broke students, splitting ramen, dreaming about our futures. She was my maid of honor, crying alongside me at my wedding. She helped us move, lugging boxes, joking about her stuff. Every Thursday night for 5 years, she'd come over with a bottle of wine, and we'd talk about everything. Work frustrations, her dating disasters, my worries about Justin, and me drifting apart. She'd listen with what seemed like genuine sympathy, nodding, saying things like, all marriages go through phases. You two just need to reconnect. She told me how lucky I was to have Justin, how supportive he was. I believed her, because questioning your best friend, that feels like questioning reality itself. If you can't trust her, who can you trust? My mother, Catherine, had died 6 years earlier. A car accident on a rainy night. Wrapped around a tree on a road she'd driven hundreds of times. The police said she was going too fast, fell asleep. Tragic but not suspicious. My Aunt Helen, my mother's older sister, had insisted something was wrong with the official story, but we all dismissed it as grief-fueled paranoia. Helen was always the difficult one, handing out pamphlets about corporate corruption, warning us about trusting the wrong people. When she died 9 months ago, alone in her house, surrounded by filing cabinets and old newspapers, I felt a pang of guilt. I hadn't visited enough. I hadn't taken her seriously. I'd written her off as paranoid when, maybe, just maybe, she'd seen patterns the rest of us were too comfortable to notice. I went to work, paid my bills, kept the apartment clean, tried to be a good wife. I did everything right, according to the unwritten rules of middle-class respectability. I thought if I worked hard enough, trusted the right people, and played by the rules, I'd be protected. Protected from the chaos you read about happening to other people. I thought doing everything right mattered. That loyalty meant something. That the life I'd built was real, solid mine. Looking back now, from this motel room with its cigarette-stained walls and that infernal squeaking bed, I can see how impossibly naive I was. How carefully constructed my entire life had been by people who saw me as useful, not human. How every relationship I trusted was performance art, designed to keep me compliant and unsuspecting. The apartment, the job, the marriage, the friendship, all of it built on foundations that were never real to begin with. But I didn't know that yet. Not 7 months ago, sitting in my normal life, believing in stability, in the protection of rules that were written by people who had no intention of following them. I didn't know Justin and Natalie had been planning my destruction since before my wedding. I didn't know my mother's death wasn't an accident. I didn't know Aunt Helen had spent her final years collecting evidence, while everyone dismissed her as crazy. I didn't know any of it. Not until I found that suitcase with $7,000, a plane ticket, and a note that offered me a choice. Disappear or fight. By then, I'd already lost everything I thought mattered. The suitcase lay on the motel bed beside me. The $7,000 in cash, spread out like evidence at a crime scene. Helen's note, soft from being folded and unfolded so many times, still clutched in my hand. I read it again, trying to make sense of words that literally rewrote my entire history. They've been planning this since before your wedding. My mother's death wasn't an accident. Finished what she started before they silenced her. I needed to understand how I'd missed it. How I'd lived inside a lie for 7 years without seeing the truth. So, I let myself remember. That Tuesday, 6 months ago, when my comfortable illusions finally shattered beyond repair. I'd woken up that morning feeling sick to my stomach. Not the flu, something deeper. A wrongness that made it hard to breathe. I tried to ignore it, going through my routine. Shower, burnt toast I couldn't eat, getting dressed while Justin slept in, claiming a late meeting. By 10 a.m., I was at my desk, staring at a social media calendar, unable to focus. My hands were cold. My heart raced. The nausea worsened. Finally, I walked into Marcus's office and said I needed to go home. I expected a fight. Marcus wasn't known for compassion, but he just looked at me with an unreadable expression and said, "Feel better," in a tone that made the hair on my neck stand up. Like he already knew something I didn't. Like he was relieved I was leaving. The drive home took 20 minutes through midday traffic. Radio off. My hands shook slightly on the wheel. I told myself I was being ridiculous, stomach bug, anxiety. But the dread grew with every block. A certainty that something was wrong, with no logical reason. When I pulled into the apartment parking lot, I saw Natalie's silver Honda Civic. Visitor spot. I'd been in that car hundreds of times. She had a key to our apartment. Sometimes she'd stop by for Wi-Fi. It shouldn't have been strange. But on a Tuesday afternoon, when Justin was at the office and Natalie was supposed to be working from her own place, something about it felt wrong. I sat in my car for a full minute, engine running, trying to talk myself out of the gut feeling. They were probably working on something. Maybe planning a surprise. Maybe Justin was sick, too, and Natalie was checking on him. I cycled through a dozen innocent explanations, each one more desperate than the last. Finally, I turned off the engine. I walked across the lot, up 3 flights of stairs. The elevator was broken again, down the hallway with its worn carpet and flickering light. I put my key in the lock as quietly as possible, though I couldn't have said why stealth felt necessary. The apartment was quiet when I stepped inside. Not empty quiet, but occupied quiet. The kind where you sense people are home even when you can't hear them. I stood in the living room, work bag still over my shoulder, listening. That's when I heard it. Laughter, coming from our bedroom. Natalie's laughter, but not her normal laugh. This was different, lower, more intimate. The kind of laugh meant for someone specific, designed to make them feel special and desired. I'd heard her use it before, years ago, when she was dating someone she really liked. Back in college, when everything felt less complicated. I stood frozen in my own living room, staring at the closed bedroom door. My brain worked overtime, trying to construct explanations that would let me keep believing in the life I thought I had. Maybe she was on the phone. Maybe Justin wasn't even home. Maybe I was just sick and paranoid. But somewhere beneath all the desperate rationalizations, I already knew what I was going to find. I crossed the living room. Each step felt like an hour. I didn't knock. Why would I knock on my own bedroom door? I just turned the handle, pushed it open. Justin and Natalie, in my bed, tangled in the gray sheets I'd washed 3 days earlier, looking at each other with an intimacy that doesn't develop in an afternoon. This was familiar territory for them. Comfortable. Routine. When they saw me, the first emotion on Natalie's face wasn't shame or guilt. It was annoyance. Like I was the one interrupting something important. Not discovering my husband and best friend systematically betraying me. She didn't scramble to cover herself. She didn't apologize. She just looked at me with an expression that said, "Why are you making this dramatic? You should have seen this coming." Justin got out of bed, pulling on his jeans with a practiced efficiency that told me this wasn't his first time getting dressed quickly in an awkward situation. That realization hit harder than the initial shock. This wasn't a spontaneous mistake, not a moment of weakness. This was routine for them, practiced. something they'd done enough times that the mechanics of it were smooth, automatic. He looked at me with an expression somehow worse than guilt. It was impatience mixed with relief. Like this confrontation was an inconvenience, but also something he'd been waiting for because pretending had gotten tiresome. "Sam," he said, in that calm voice he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. "We need to talk about this like adults. This isn't what it looks like." The absurdity of that statement almost made me laugh. It was exactly what it looked like. But he stood there in our bedroom, in the middle of being caught, and tried to gaslight me into questioning my own eyes. Like I was the one creating a problem by refusing his reframing of reality. Natalie sat up, holding the sheet around herself with a modesty that would have been funny if it hadn't been so insulting. She had the nerve to look at me with something close to pity. "We didn't want you to find out this way," she said. "Like there was a good way to discover your husband and best friend having an affair. But honestly, Sam, this has been coming for a long time. You had to know things weren't working." The presumption in that statement stole my breath. Not just that she'd been sleeping with Justin, but that she thought I should have known. That this was predictable or even my fault for not noticing sooner. That their betrayal was justified because my marriage had problems I'd been too stupid or blind to recognize. I asked a question I knew I'd regret. "How long?" My voice sounded strange, too calm, too detached. Like I was asking about something that didn't matter, not the destruction of my entire life. Justin answered in the same emotionless tone. "Does it matter? Long enough that we're sure about this. Long enough that pretending became harder than being honest." Pretending. That word cut deeper than any of the rest. How long had he been pretending to love me? How long had every kiss goodbye been a performance? Every "I love you" a lie? And Natalie, how long had she been sitting on my couch every Thursday night, drinking my wine, listening to me talk about my marriage problems, offering advice designed to keep me complacent while she was sleeping with my husband the rest of the week? I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw things or make a scene. I just turned around, walked back into the living room, and started throwing clothes into a duffel bag from the hall closet. My laptop, chargers, toiletries. The practical things you need to survive when your life implodes. Justin followed me, still shirtless, still trying to have that adult conversation, still acting like this was a reasonable situation to be resolved through calm discussion. I left without another word, walked out of the apartment I'd helped pay for, drove to a coffee shop parking lot 3 miles away, and cried until I couldn't breathe. Then I called my cousin Emma and asked if I could crash on her couch. That was 6 months ago. Now, sitting in this motel room with Helen's note and $7,000 in cash, I understood that Tuesday had been even worse than I'd thought. The betrayal hadn't just been personal. It had been calculated, planned, part of something bigger, connected to my mother's death and whatever Helen had spent her final years investigating. They'd been playing a long game with my life as the board, and I'd been too trusting, too naive, too desperate to believe in the stability of normal life to see what was happening until it was too late. I'd been on Emma's couch for 5 days when Marcus called. My cousin was kind, but I was trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, go to work every day, pretending that sleeping in someone else's house with all my possessions in a duffel bag was just a temporary inconvenience. Marcus asked me to come to his office first thing Monday morning. His voice had that careful tone people use when delivering bad news. I told myself it was about a new client or a performance review. I didn't let myself think about the alternative. I showed up at 8:15 a.m., wearing clothes I'd ironed on Emma's board, wanting to look professional and put together, even though I felt like I was barely holding myself intact. Marcus's door was open. He waved me in with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been satisfaction hidden behind a professional mask. "Samantha," he said, gesturing to the chair, "I need to talk to you about some changes in the department." I sat down, hands folded, trying to keep my face neutral. Marcus shuffled papers, not quite meeting my eyes. My stomach dropped before he even started speaking. "We're restructuring the marketing department due to budget constraints," he said, that careful corporate language designed to sound official and impersonal. "Unfortunately, your position is being eliminated. We're offering a severance package." He slid a folder across the desk. I didn't touch it. I just stared at him, my brain screaming. Not now. Not when everything else is falling apart. "Budget constraints?" I repeated, my voice distant, hollow. "We just signed 3 new clients. I've seen the quarterly reports. We're not struggling." Marcus's expression didn't change. "These decisions are made at levels above my control, Samantha. I'm sorry, but the decision is final." I wanted to ask if this had anything to do with Justin. Maybe Marcus had heard about the divorce, decided I was a liability, but something in his face stopped me. A flicker of discomfort that suggested asking wouldn't change anything, only make it more awkward. I took the folder, left his office, and packed up my desk in 20 minutes. Nobody made eye contact. My coworkers suddenly became intensely interested in their computer screens. By 9 a.m., I was walking out of Brennan and Associates with a cardboard box containing 4 years of my professional life and a severance package that barely covered 2 months of rent. Later, much later, I discovered Marcus and Justin had been college roommates. Their connection had always been part of the architecture of my life without my knowledge. My job had never been secure. It was conditional on remaining useful to people whose agendas I didn't understand. But sitting in my car that morning, I just felt the ground shift again. Another support kicked out while I was still trying to regain balance from the first blow. The divorce proceedings started 2 weeks after I lost my job. Justin hired Elizabeth Hartley, an attorney famous for winning cases through aggression and cruelty. My attorney was court-appointed, a tired man named Gerald Stokes, who seemed to have given up on justice somewhere in the previous decade. Elizabeth filed motions painting me as unstable, irresponsible, dangerous. She used my job loss as evidence of my inability to function. My temporary housing with Emma, proof I couldn't manage my own life. Every detail of my current circumstances became ammunition. The judge, Robert Cunningham, a man in his late 50s, moved through his docket efficiently. He seemed to have made his decisions before hearing any testimony. Every motion Elizabeth filed, he approved. Every request Gerald made, the judge denied with barely a glance. Justin kept our apartment because his name was listed first on the mortgage, even though I'd contributed equally for 5 years. He kept our car because I'd missed 2 payments. He kept the furniture, the savings, the retirement funds. The settlement left me with my clothing, my laptop, and barely enough money for 3 months' rent at an apartment I could actually afford. The worst part wasn't losing the possessions or even the financial devastation. It was watching Natalie take the stand as a character witness against me. She wore a navy blue designer suit. I recognized it. We'd picked it out together 2 years earlier, during a shopping trip where we'd spent an entire afternoon laughing in dressing rooms. I told her it made her look professional and confident. Now, she was wearing it to testify against me. She sat in the witness stand with perfect posture, hands folded, and lied with the conviction that comes from practice. She told Judge Cunningham I'd been unstable for months, made concerning comments about self-harm, become paranoid and difficult. That Justin had stayed in the marriage out of obligation and fear, not love. None of it was true, not a single word. But Natalie delivered each lie with perfect emotional calibration. Her voice broke slightly at the right moments. Her expression showed concern mixed with reluctance, like testifying against me was painful, but necessary for my own good. Judge Cunningham listened, nodding sympathetically, taking notes. When Gerald tried to cross-examine her about her relationship with Justin, Elizabeth objected. The judge sustained it immediately, cutting off any inquiry that might reveal when the affair had started, or that Natalie's testimony was motivated by anything other than concern for my well-being. I sat at the defendant's table, watching my best friend of over a decade systematically destroy what was left of my credibility. And I understood. This had been coordinated. The affair, the job loss, the divorce proceedings. All timed and executed with a precision that went beyond coincidence. After the divorce, Emma let me stay for 3 weeks until her husband, David, started making pointed comments. I'd hear him talking to Emma in their bedroom at night, his voice carrying through the thin walls. She can't stay here indefinitely. You're not helping her by letting her avoid dealing with her situation. She needs to find her own place. Emma would defend me, her voice tired. She's going through a difficult time. She just needs a little more support. But I could hear the doubt creeping in, the exhaustion of dealing with someone else's crisis. I started looking for anywhere else to go before Emma had to ask me to leave. My former colleague Diane offered her couch for 10 days, then decided my negative energy was too much. A friend from college offered a week, then remembered family visiting. Another friend offered 5 days before her roommate complained. Everyone was sympathetic right up until sympathy became inconvenient. Until supporting me required actual, sustained sacrifice, rather than just kind words and temporary gestures. Then, suddenly, they remembered prior commitments, family obligations, personal boundaries. I understood it on some level. Nobody wants to live with someone else's crisis indefinitely. But the speed with which people retracted their support taught me something about how conditional most relationships really are. How quickly compassion expires when it becomes uncomfortable. When I finally scraped together enough money from freelance social media work to pay for a weekly rate at the Crossroads Motel, it felt less like hitting rock bottom, and more like finally finding ground that wouldn't shift beneath me. At least the motel didn't pretend to care. At least Rita at the front desk didn't offer false comfort or temporary sympathy that would evaporate when I became inconvenient. Room 14 became my address. My home, the place where I'd eventually find that suitcase, and a note that explained why my destruction had been so systematic and so complete. Room 14 at the Crossroads Motel. 3 days after the last friend stopped returning my calls. I'd scraped together $200 from freelance social media work for a bakery and a pet grooming business, both paid irregularly, weeks after I submitted invoices. The motel sat off Highway 52, the kind of place where the weekly rate was more prominent than the nightly rate. The sign out front had been missing letters for so long, nobody bothered to fix it. Rita at the front desk had a name tag and an expression that suggested she'd seen this scenario thousands of times. Women alone, duffel bags, desperate eyes, paying weekly while pretending this was temporary. She didn't ask questions. She just took my cash, handed me a key with a faded gold 14 on a green plastic tag, and recited the rules in a flat voice. Weekly rate includes utilities. Checkout is $11 if you're leaving. No visitors after 10. Laundry room around back, $3 a load. Vending machines, take bills or coins. I thanked her, carried my duffel bag across the parking lot to a door that had been painted blue once, but had faded to an indecisive color. The key stuck, requiring 3 jiggles before it finally gave way. The room smelled like decades of cigarette smoke layered under industrial cleaner. 2 cents fighting a war neither could win. The carpet was a brown pattern designed to hide stains, which meant it was probably hiding decades of them. The bed sagged in the middle, like it had given up on supporting anything, including people's hopes. A small table by the window, 2 mismatched chairs, and a TV from the early 2000s on a dresser with drawers that didn't close properly. The bathroom was tiny, a shower stall that had seen better years, a mirror that made everything look slightly yellow. This was home. Now, this was what my life had been reduced to. A room that charged by the week. In a motel where nobody asked questions, because asking questions might require caring about the answers. I tried to establish some kind of routine, just to keep myself from completely falling apart. I'd wake early, make instant coffee using the room's small machine, and spend mornings applying for jobs online. Marketing coordinator, social media manager, anything related to my experience. Dozens of applications every week. Customizing cover letters. Updating my resume. Nobody called back. Not even rejection emails. My applications disappeared into whatever digital void companies use to sort through hundreds of desperate candidates. Nothing. In the afternoons, I'd work on freelance projects. Small businesses needing someone to manage their Facebook page, write newsletters, design graphics. The work paid poorly, arrived sporadically, but it was enough to cover my weekly motel rate, with a little leftover for food. Dinner was usually instant ramen in the microwave. Sometimes, I'd splurge on a can of soup or a frozen meal from the convenience store 2 blocks away. I'd eat on the edge of the bed, watching TV shows I didn't care about, just to have noise that wasn't the sound of my own thoughts. My neighbors were mostly invisible. A long-haul trucker named Dale, who'd park his rig in the far corner of the lot and nod sometimes. A woman who worked night shifts, curtains permanently closed, coming and going at odd hours. A man in his 60s next door, playing country music just low enough that I couldn't complain, but loud enough to hear through the thin walls. I avoided looking at myself in the bathroom mirror. I didn't recognize the woman staring back. She had my face, but something fundamental had changed in her eyes. Something had broken and not healed right, leaving her looking hollow and defeated. Ashamed. This was my life now. This was what betrayal and systematic destruction looked like. A motel room that smelled like smoke and failure. Meals costing less than $2. And the crushing understanding that nobody was coming to save me. Everyone who might have cared had already decided I was too much trouble. I'd been in room 14 for 3 weeks when I noticed a suitcase. I only found it because I dropped my phone charger and it rolled under the bed. I got down on my hands and knees, reaching into the dusty space, and my hand hit something solid. Something that shouldn't have been there. I pulled it out into the light. An old suitcase. Battered brown leather. Brass corners oxidized to a dull green. It looked like something from another era. A luggage tag was attached to the handle with twine. When I turned it over, my hand started shaking. Samantha Marie Garrett. My full name. Written in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere. The precise, careful script of my Aunt Helen. I sat on the floor, holding the suitcase, trying to make sense of how it got there. Helen had died 9 months ago. I'd attended her funeral, stood at her graveside. She'd lived alone for decades, died alone, surrounded by filing cabinets and old newspapers. Everyone had said it was sad, but not surprising given how she'd isolated herself with her conspiracy theories and warnings about trusting the wrong people. How had her suitcase ended up under my bed in a motel room I'd only been living in for 3 weeks? Had she known I'd end up here? Left it with Rita at the front desk? The logistics seemed impossible, but the evidence was right in front of me. The suitcase was locked with 2 brass latches. I turned it over, checking the sides and bottom. A small plastic bag taped underneath. Inside the bag, a key. Helen had been paranoid, but also practical in ways that only made sense to her. She had things in plain sight, left clues that required careful looking. Trusted the right person would find what she'd left behind. I peeled off the tape, removed the key, and unlocked the suitcase with trembling hands. Inside, money. $70,000 in cash, bundled with rubber bands. Mostly hundreds with some 50s mixed in. It smelled faintly of mothballs and old books, like it had been stored for years. Underneath the money, a plane ticket. Printed on paper, yellowing at the edges. Portland, Oregon. Departure date, 4 days from now. And underneath the ticket, a note. Handwritten on yellow legal paper in Helen's distinctive script. Samantha, this is just travel money. The real fortune is waiting at this address. Don't trust Justin. Don't trust Natalie. They've been planning this since before your wedding. Finish what your mother started before they silenced her. The truth is important. Use it wisely. I read those words 3 times. Each reading made them feel more impossible and more true at the same time. Don't trust Justin. Don't trust Natalie. They've been planning this since before your wedding. My mother, Catherine, had died 6 years ago. What everyone called a car accident. Late night, rainy road, car wrapped around a tree. Police reports said she was speeding, fell asleep. Tragic but not suspicious. Helen had insisted something was wrong. She'd pulled me aside at the funeral, whispering urgently that my mother had been investigating financial fraud at the pharmaceutical company where she worked. That her death was too convenient. That I needed to be careful. I dismissed it as grief. Everyone had. Helen was always seeing conspiracies. Handing out pamphlets. We learned to nod politely and change the subject. Now, I was sitting on the floor of a motel room, and everything I thought I knew was collapsing. I spent that night in room 14, staring at the money and the note, unable to sleep, unable to think about anything but the choice Helen was forcing me to make. By morning, I decided I wasn't running. I was done being the person things happened to. I was done disappearing, while the people who destroyed my life got to move forward without consequences. I packed my duffel bag with a few possessions that mattered. Some clothes, my laptop, the $70,000 bundled in a waterproof bag. I left a note for Rita at the front desk, saying I'd paid through the week but wouldn't be returning. She looked at me with an expression that might have been concern or relief that her weekly tenant problem was solving itself. Good luck, she said. Could have meant anything. The flight to Portland left early on a Thursday morning from a regional airport 40 minutes away. I'd booked it with Helen's cash. Spent the entire drive trying not to think about what I was actually doing. Flying across the country to follow instructions from a dead and everyone called paranoid. Chasing a conspiracy theory connecting my husband's affair to my mother's death 6 years ago. Believing that the systematic destruction of my life was part of something bigger, more calculated than simple betrayal. When I said it like that, it sounded crazy. But Helen's note was in my bag. The money was real. The plane ticket had my name on it. Crazy or not, I was going. The airline was one of those budget carriers that charged extra for everything. I paid the $15 to bring my duffel bag because arguing wasn't worth the energy. Then spent 3 hours wedged between a businessman who monopolized both armrests and a college kid who watched videos without headphones. I didn't sleep. The seats were designed by people who hated the human spine, but that wasn't really why I stayed awake. My mind wouldn't stop cycling through questions that had no easy answers. What had my mother discovered that made her dangerous enough to kill? How deep did Justin and Natalie's involvement actually go? Had any part of my relationship with Justin been real? Or had it all been performance from the very beginning? Were there genuine moments mixed with the lies? Or had every kiss, every declaration of love, been calculated manipulation? The businessman next to me kept glancing at the duffel bag on my lap. I wanted to tell him it contained $70,000 and possibly the key to understanding why my entire life had been systematically dismantled. But I just stared out the window at darkness, punctuated by scattered lights below. Cities and towns full of people whose lives probably made sense to them in ways mine no longer did. Portland greeted me with gray skies and rain. Colder, heavier, the kind of wet that seeps through clothing and settles into bones. I rented a car with Helen's cash and a credit card I'd been avoiding. The rental agent processed the paperwork with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. The address Helen had written led me out of the city toward Lake Oswego, a suburb that felt quiet in a way that suggested money, privacy, and neighbors who minded their own business. The GPS guided me through streets lined with mature trees and houses set back from the road, each property maintaining a polite distance from its neighbors. Helen's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, a small ranch-style place from the 70s, not updated much since. The windows were dark. The lawn had grown wild, grass reaching heights that suggested nobody had mowed it in months. The driveway was cracked, weeds pushing through the pavement. It was the kind of property that screams, someone died here, and nobody knows what to do with it yet. I parked in the driveway and sat in the rental car for a full minute, engine running, trying to decide if I was actually brave enough to go through with this. Helen's note had given me an address, told me the truth was waiting. But what if the truth was worse than the lies? What if whatever I found made everything more complicated, instead of providing the clarity I so desperately craved? I turned off the engine and got out before I could talk myself out of it. The front door was locked, but Helen had left a second key in the suitcase, taped inside a small envelope marked house. I let myself in, stepped into air that smelled stale and undisturbed. The particular smell of a place where nobody had opened a window, or cooked a meal, or lived an actual life in months. The interior was exactly what I'd expected. Books everywhere, stacked on shelves, piled on tables. Filing cabinets in the living room where most people would put a couch. Papers organized in boxes with labels in Helen's precise handwriting. The kitchen looked barely used, coffee maker, microwave, a sink full of dishes nobody had washed before she died. But the note had directed me to the shed behind the house, not the house itself. I walked through to the back door, stepped into an overgrown yard where grass and weeds had taken over what might have once been a garden. The shed sat in the far corner, a structure maybe 10 by 12 feet, with newer locks on the door than anything else on the property. That detail stood out immediately. Everything else looked old and neglected, but those locks were recent. Industrial, the kind of hardware you use when you're protecting something that matters. I used the third key Helen had left, this one marked shed. The lock opened smoothly, like it had been recently maintained. Inside, the shed was organized in a way that made the house look chaotic by comparison. Filing cabinets lined one wall, each drawer labeled with years spanning from the 1980s to last year. Boxes stacked along another wall, indexed with the precision of a professional archive. And in the back corner, partially hidden under a tarp and some strategically placed paint cans, a trap door set into the floor. I moved the paint cans, pulled back the tarp. The trap door had a handle and a lock. And when I tried the fourth key Helen had left, it opened, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. I turned on my phone's flashlight and climbed down into what turned out to be a crawl space, converted into a climate-controlled evidence room. The space was maybe 7 feet tall, 15 feet square, lit by battery-powered LED strips that flickered on when I reached the bottom. The air was cool and dry, maintained by a dehumidifier humming quietly in a corner. More filing cabinets, more boxes, a table with a laptop, and what looked like an old cassette player. Scattered throughout, photographs and documents protected in clear plastic sleeves. Helen had spent years building this. A secret archive, documenting something she believed was worth preserving, even if everyone thought she was paranoid for doing it. I started with the photographs. They were right in front of me, arranged on the table like evidence in a trial. The first one I picked up made my hand shake so badly I nearly dropped it. My mother, Catherine, standing between Justin and Natalie, at what was clearly some kind of conference. All three of them wearing name tags and business casual clothing, smiling at the camera like colleagues who knew each other well. The banner in the background said Meridian Pharmaceuticals Annual Research Summit. The date printed on the bottom of the photo, 8 years ago. 8 years. 2 full years before I'd supposedly met Justin by chance at a dinner party. 2 years before our relationship had even started. I stared at that photograph, my brain scrambling for explanations. Maybe they'd met briefly. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe the photo was mislabeled. But I knew better. This wasn't coincidence. Justin hadn't met me by accident. He'd been positioned in my life deliberately, cultivated as a relationship by people who needed access to my mother and saw me as the easiest entry point. I'd been a target before I was a girlfriend, a mark before I was a wife. And every moment of intimacy, every declaration of love, every promise about our future together, all of it had been performance art in service of something I was only now beginning to understand. I set down the photograph with shaking hands and reached for the cassette player. It was old, a portable model from the 80s with built-in speakers and a handle. Next to it, a stack of cassette tapes, each one labeled in Helen's handwriting. Dates, names, brief descriptions. I picked up the first tape in the stack. Justin Garrett and Richard Moss. March 2019. Discussion of Catherine Vaughn investigation status. My mother's name. My chest tightened. I loaded the tape, pressed play. Static. Then voices. My hands went cold. The first voice belonged to Justin. I'd heard that voice every day for 7 years. Listened to it tell me he loved me. Listened to it make promises about our future. Now I was hearing it discuss my mother like she was a problem that needed solving. Catherine's getting too close, Justin said, his tone businesslike, completely devoid of emotion. She's made copies of the trial data, and she's been meeting with someone at the FDA. I don't know who yet, but I'm working on finding out through Samantha. A second voice responded, older, more authoritative. Richard Moss, it had to be. We can't let this go public. The approvals we've secured are worth billions. If she exposes the data manipulation, we're looking at criminal charges and the end of the company. Can you contain her through the daughter? I've tried, Justin said, but Catherine doesn't discuss work details with Samantha. She's protective, thinks she's keeping her daughter safe by not involving her in whatever she's investigating. It's actually making my job harder because Samantha doesn't know anything useful. Then we need to consider other options, Richard said, and something in his tone made my blood run cold. More permanent solutions. We can't risk everything because one accountant developed a conscience. I paused the tape. I couldn't breathe properly. They were discussing killing my mother, planning it like it was a business decision, weighing options, considering strategies. And Justin, the man I'd married, the man I'd built a life with, was part of that conversation. He'd been using me to gather information about what my mother knew. And when that didn't work, he'd participated in planning her murder. I forced myself to press play again. There are ways to make it look accidental, Richard continued. We have people who specialize in this kind of problem. Car accidents happen all the time, especially on rainy nights on dangerous roads. Nobody questions those. What about afterward? Justin asked. If Catherine dies, Samantha's going to be devastated. She'll lean on me for support, which gives me more access to her life. But there's also that Aunt Helen. She's paranoid and suspicious of everything. If Catherine dies, Helen's going to start asking questions. Let her ask, Richard said dismissively. Nobody takes Helen Vaughn seriously. She's been crying wolf about corporate corruption for decades. If she starts claiming Catherine's death wasn't an accident, people will just think she's being paranoid again. The key is making sure there's nothing concrete for her to find. We clean up thoroughly, make sure the accident investigation is handled by people we can trust, and move on. The recording continued for another 20 minutes, detailing logistics and contingencies, discussing my mother's murder with the same tone people use when planning a vacation or organizing a work project. When it finally ended, I sat in the silence of Helen's underground archive, trying to process what I'd just heard. Justin hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been a plant from the beginning, positioned in my life specifically to monitor my mother's investigation into Meridian Pharmaceuticals. He'd courted me, proposed to me, married me, all as part of a strategy to gain access to information that might threaten a multi-billion-dollar fraud scheme. And when using me didn't work, when my mother kept her investigation separate from me, they made it look like an accident on a rainy night. I found more tapes, conversations between Natalie and someone named Dr. Sarah Chin, apparently Natalie's aunt and a senior researcher at Meridian. These recordings revealed that Natalie had been assigned to befriend me after my mother's death, to make sure I remained isolated and manageable, to monitor whether I showed any signs of investigating what had really happened. Every Thursday wine night had been surveillance. Every heart-to-heart had been data collection. Our entire friendship had been fabricated. I don't know how long I sat in that crawl space, listening, reading, piecing together the full scope of what had been done to my mother and to me. Hours, maybe, long enough that my back ached from the concrete floor and my eyes burned from reading in the LED light. Finally, I found the laptop Helen had left. It was plugged in, with an arrow pointing to a video file on the desktop labeled for Samantha. I opened it. Helen's face filled the screen. She looked exactly like I remembered from the last time I'd seen her, 2 years ago, though visibly ill. Her face was drawn. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted the camera, but her eyes were sharp, focused. She wore a cardigan I recognized, navy blue with wooden buttons, the same one she'd worn to every family gathering for the past decade. "Samantha," she began, her voice steady despite the physical deterioration visible in her face. "If you're watching this, it means I'm dead and you found my archive, which means you're probably angry and confused and wondering why I didn't tell you any of this while I was alive." She paused to take a sip of water. "The answer is that I tried. I warned you about Justin at your engagement party. I pulled you aside and told you to be careful, that something about him felt wrong. I told you to watch how Natalie behaved around him, to pay attention to the small things that didn't quite add up. You thought I was being paranoid. You said I saw conspiracies everywhere and needed to let you live your own life without interference." Helen's expression softened slightly, and I don't blame you for that. I'd spent decades being the family member everyone described as difficult and eccentric, the one who handed out pamphlets about corporate corruption at Thanksgiving, the one who warned about trusting people with perfect smiles and convenient explanations. By the time I tried to warn you about Justin, you'd already learned to dismiss everything I said as paranoia. She adjusted the camera, leaning forward. "Your mother, Catherine, was my best friend long before she was your mother. We grew up protecting each other, and when she discovered what Meridian was doing, she came to me first because she knew I would help her document everything properly. We spent months building a case, collecting evidence, preparing to go to federal authorities. Then, she died in that convenient accident, and I knew exactly what had happened, even though I couldn't prove it yet." Helen coughed, covering her mouth with a tissue. When she pulled it away, I could see blood on the white fabric. "I've spent the last 6 years of my life collecting the evidence you're sitting with right now. Every document, every recording, every financial trail. I did it because I loved your mother, and because I love you, because I couldn't let them get away with killing Catherine and destroying your life without any consequences." She looked directly at the camera with an intensity that made it feel like she was in the room with me. "You have 2 choices, Samantha, just like your mother had 2 choices before they killed her. You can take the money I left you and disappear, change your identity, move somewhere far away, live comfortably and safely, and never look back. Nobody would blame you for choosing survival over justice. You've already lost so much. You deserve peace if that's what you want." Helen coughed again, harder this time. Had to pause for a long moment before continuing. "Or you can fight. You can use everything I've collected and burn these people down. Expose Meridian. Expose Justin and Natalie, and everyone who participated in your mother's murder and your destruction. It won't be easy. They have money, lawyers, political connections. You'll be threatened. You'll be harassed. You might be in danger. But Samantha, if you fight, you might actually win. And even if you don't win completely, you'll make them pay a price for what they did." She smiled. That crooked smile I remembered from childhood, when she'd sneak me extra cookies or let me stay up past my bedtime reading. "Either way, you'll have a story worth telling. Your mother would be proud of you no matter what you choose. But I think we both know which choice lets you sleep at night." Helen's expression became serious again. "I love you, Samantha. Don't let them win." She reached for something off camera, then looked back at the screen. "Oh, and there's one more thing I haven't mentioned in the written materials. Mountain Pacific Credit Union account number 77,743. Password is your mother's employee number from Meridian. That's the real fortune. The $70,000 in the suitcase is just travel money. Use what's in that account to fight or use it to run. But for God's sake, use it." The video ended. The screen went black. I sat staring at the blank screen for a long time. Then I pulled out my phone and searched for Mountain Pacific Credit Union's phone number. The call took 45 minutes of navigating automated menus before I finally reached a human being. I gave them the account number Helen had mentioned. The representative went quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. "Ma'am," she said finally, her voice suddenly much more professional. "I'm going to need to transfer you to our wealth management division. Please hold." The hold music was classical piano, sounding like it was being played underwater. After what felt like an eternity, a woman named Patricia came on the line and asked me to verify my identity using my mother's employee number as the password. When I gave her the numbers, she paused, then explained in careful language that Helen had established a trust in my name. "The trust contains stock portfolios, real estate holdings, and intellectual property rights that your mother secured before her death," Patricia said. "The total value is approximately $14 million. Structured to protect it from legal challenges and ensure that only you can access it. $14 million. The The words didn't sound real. They sounded like dialogue from a movie about someone else's life, not mine. I was sitting in a dead woman's underground archive, surrounded by evidence of conspiracy and murder, and now being told that I had access to more money than I could properly comprehend. Helen had spent 6 years not just collecting evidence, but building a financial foundation that would allow me to fight without being destroyed by legal fees and endless court battles. She'd wrapped justice like a gift, left it with enough resources to actually achieve it. I chose to fight. Using the contact information Helen had left in her files, I called Agent Maria Torres at the FBI's Portland field office. She answered on the third ring with a tone that suggested she was busy. "This is Torres. My name is Samantha Garrett," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "My Aunt Helen Vaughn left me information about a case I think you've been trying to build about Meridian Pharmaceuticals." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I checked my phone. "Where are you right now?" Maria asked, her tone completely changed. "At my aunt's property. Don't leave. I'm coming to you. Don't talk to anyone else about this. Don't touch anything else in whatever Helen left you. Just wait for me. I'll be there in 40 minutes. She hung up before I could respond. Maria arrived in 35 minutes, which suggested she'd driven faster than was legal. She was in her late 40s, gray streaking through dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing jeans and a blazer with an FBI badge clipped to her belt. She looked at me, standing in Helen's overgrown backyard, with an expression that was part skepticism, part hope. "Show me," she said. I led her to the shed, down the ladder, into the underground archive. I watched her face change as she took in the filing cabinets, the boxes, the organized documentation of 6 years of investigation. She put on latex gloves before touching anything, pulling out files and reading with an intensity that made me understand why Helen had trusted her. "Your aunt was either the most thorough investigator I've ever encountered, or she was completely brilliant," Maria said after about 20 minutes of reviewing documents. "Probably both. This is enough to open a federal investigation. We're talking conspiracy charges, fraud, possibly murder if we can prove the car accident was arranged. Samantha, you just handed me a case that could take down a major pharmaceutical company." The investigation that followed moved with bureaucratic slowness that Maria assured me was normal. Building cases against corporations with billions in assets and armies of lawyers takes patience. Subpoenas had to be drafted, reviewed, approved. Bank records needed freezing, requiring warrants, which required probable cause, which required more paperwork than I'd thought existed. Former Meridian employees, fired or quit under suspicious circumstances, were interviewed. The pharmaceutical industry's informal network of whistleblowers started emerging, sharing their own stories of fraud and retaliation. Maria helped me find a small apartment in Portland, a one-bedroom in an old building with hardwood floors that creaked and windows that rattled when trains passed 2 blocks away. It was infinitely better than room 14 at the Crossroads Motel, but I kept it modest. I didn't want to feel like I was spending resources that should be reserved for the legal battle ahead. I used money from Helen's trust to pay rent and buy groceries, living simply while the investigation moved forward. I met with prosecutors every few weeks. They had detailed questions about every piece of evidence Helen had collected, asking me to explain timelines, relationships, conversations I'd overheard years ago that I hadn't understood were significant at the time. They want to know about Justin's schedule, Natalie's visits, my mother's behavior in the months before she died. I answered everything as thoroughly as I could, watching them take notes and exchange glances that suggested they were building something substantial. Maria called periodically with updates that mostly consisted of, "We're making progress and don't talk to anyone about this." It's what federal agents say when they can't share details, but want you to know you haven't been forgotten. The waiting was harder than anything that had come before. I'd handed over everything Helen had collected, and now I was just existing in limbo, hoping that the machinery of justice would actually work for once, instead of grinding up innocent people and spitting them out as statistics. Then, months after I'd first met Maria in Helen's underground archive, things started happening with a speed that suggested the government had finally accumulated enough evidence to move forward confidently. It began on a Wednesday morning in early spring. Meridian Pharmaceuticals' headquarters got raided by federal agents. They carried boxes out of a gleaming glass building that looked like a monument to corporate success. The images made national news, showing employees standing in the parking lot, looking confused and scared, while agents and FBI windbreakers methodically dismantled what had seemed like an untouchable empire. Richard Moss, the CEO whose voice I'd heard on Helen's recordings discussing my mother's murder like it was a minor inconvenience, was arrested at his home. News cameras caught footage of him being let out in handcuffs, past his neighbors, past reporters shouting questions he didn't answer, past a life built on fraud, now collapsing in real time. Maria called me that afternoon to tell me Justin had been arrested at his office, at a tech startup where he'd been working since the divorce. I watched the footage on the local news that evening, rewinding it multiple times because apparently I developed unhealthy coping mechanisms around witnessing karma manifest in handcuffs and perp walks. Justin maintained his composure, didn't speak to reporters, walked with his head up like he was enduring a minor inconvenience, rather than being arrested for conspiracy to commit murder and fraud. But I could see something in his eyes that looked like fear mixed with disbelief. Like he genuinely thought he was untouchable and was only now realizing how wrong he'd been. Natalie was arrested 2 days later at a coffee shop in Seattle, where she'd apparently moved. She'd used her Meridian payments to fund a graphic design business that was actually legitimate this time. According to news reports, she cried during her arrest. The tears felt performative to me, given that she'd testified against me in divorce court without showing a single genuine emotion. Her attorney issued a statement claiming she'd been manipulated by Justin, had no idea about the extent of the conspiracy, that she was a victim herself, taken advantage of by more powerful people. But I'd heard the recordings of her conversations with Dr. Sarah Chin. I'd read the documents showing payments made specifically to maintain her friendship with me as a monitoring operation. Natalie hadn't been a victim. She'd been a willing participant. She'd cultivated our friendship deliberately to ensure I remained isolated and manageable after my mother's death. Every Thursday wine night had been surveillance. Every conversation where she'd encouraged me to trust Justin, to ignore my instincts, to believe that my marriage problems were normal, had been calculated manipulation. The betrayal for Natalie cut deeper than Justin's in some ways. I'd chosen to marry Justin, but Natalie had been assigned to me, without my knowledge or consent. Our entire friendship had been fabricated from the beginning. Then came the news about Judge Robert Cunningham. He resigned from the bench with a statement about wanting to spend more time with family, which is what corrupt officials say when they're hoping resignation will prevent criminal prosecution. It didn't work. He was indicted 3 weeks later for accepting bribes and manipulating court proceedings. Documents Helen had collected showed he'd purchased a vacation home through a trust that traced back to Meridian, that he'd been ruling in favor of corporate interests for years in exchange for payments disguised as consulting fees. Every case he presided over in the last decade was reviewed. My divorce case was among the first. A new judge took 15 minutes to determine that the original ruling had been based on fabricated testimony and biased proceedings. Everything Cunningham had decided was vacated, erased, like it had never happened. Maria called me the day the review of my case was completed. Your marriage to Justin is being annulled rather than finalized as a divorce, she said. The court's declaring it invalid from the beginning due to fraud. You're also getting a formal apology from the judicial system, for whatever that's worth. It was worth something. Not enough to undo the damage or erase the months of suffering, but something. The formal apology from the judicial system arrived as a letter on official court stationery, signed by 3 judges. It acknowledged that I'd been subjected to proceedings fundamentally compromised by corruption and fabricated testimony. It expressed regret for the harm caused by a system that had failed to protect me from coordinated fraud. It was 2 pages of careful legal language that tried to convey remorse without admitting liability in a way that might open the courts to further lawsuits. I read it once and filed it away with all the other documents that marked the destruction and slow rebuilding of my life. The apology didn't undo the months I'd spent sleeping on couches and in motel rooms. It didn't erase the trauma of watching my best friend testify against me with lies, or the humiliation of losing everything because a judge had been bought. But it was acknowledgement, official recognition that what had been done to me was wrong. The trials began 6 months after the arrests and stretched across a year and a half. Maria had warned me that cases this complex moved slowly, that building prosecutions against multiple defendants with interconnected criminal activity required patience and meticulous attention to procedural detail. She was right. The legal process ground forward with a bureaucratic thoroughness that makes glaciers look fast by comparison. Richard Moss went to trial first. His case became a media spectacle that dominated news cycles for weeks. Pharmaceutical industry whistleblowers testified about the culture of fraud at Meridian, describing how executives incentivized researchers to manipulate trial data and how safety concerns were systematically buried when they threatened profitable drug approvals. Patients who'd been harmed by medications that should never have reached the market shared their stories. A woman whose daughter had died from complications related to a drug Meridian had rushed through approval with falsified safety data, spoke for 20 minutes about watching her child suffer. Forensic accountants explained money trails that connected executive bonuses directly to fraudulent approvals, showing how Richard Moss had personally profited from every dangerous medication the company brought to market. The jury deliberated for 6 days. They returned with guilty verdicts on 17 counts, including fraud, conspiracy, bribery, and reckless endangerment. Richard Moss showed no visible emotion. He stood while the judge read the sentence: 23 years in federal prison and forfeiture of approximately $40 million in assets. He was 62 years old, which meant he'd likely spend the rest of his life incarcerated. I watched the sentencing from the gallery, sitting in the back row where I could observe without being noticed. When the judge finished reading the sentence and the bailiffs led Richard Moss away in handcuffs, I felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite closure. It was more like watching a long mathematical equation finally balance, all the variables falling into their proper places after years of deliberate miscalculation. Justin's trial was smaller and quieter, without the media attention that had surrounded Richard Moss. But it was more personal for me. I attended every day, sitting in the same seat in the back row, watching prosecutors present evidence of his role in monitoring my mother, his participation in planning her murder, his 7-year marriage to me as an extended intelligence gathering operation. The recordings Helen had collected were played in court. I listened to Justin's voice discussing my mother like she was an obstacle that needed removing. Heard him report on conversations I'd had about her work. Heard him strategize about how to approach my mother's murder. Heard him continue receiving payments and participating in the conspiracy years after her death. The prosecutors presented bank records showing payments made to him throughout our marriage, demonstrating that he'd been compensated for every month he'd spent pretending to love me. His defense attorney tried to argue that Justin had been a low-level participant, manipulated by more powerful people, coerced into involvement he hadn't fully understood. But the recordings showed someone who'd been enthusiastic and willing, who'd made strategic suggestions about how to approach my mother's murder. The jury returned guilty verdicts on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and racketeering. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison. When the verdict was read, Justin looked at me across the courtroom. His expression was complicated, something between anger and resignation, as if he couldn't quite believe that the woman he'd married as part of a surveillance operation had been the one to bring the evidence that destroyed him. I looked back without blinking, without emotion, because I was done being intimidated by people who'd systematically underestimated what I was capable of when pushed far enough. Natalie accepted a plea deal rather than going to trial. In exchange for testimony against other defendants, her sentence was reduced to 8 years. She provided information about Dr. Sarah Chin and other Meridian employees who'd been part of the conspiracy, helping prosecutors build cases against people who might otherwise have escaped accountability. 6 months after her sentencing, I received a letter from her, 3 pages, written on prison stationery, full of apologies and explanations about how she'd been young and desperate for money when Meridian first approached her. How she'd made terrible choices she regretted every day. How being assigned to befriend me had started as just a job, but had become complicated when she'd actually grown to care about me, despite the lies. She asked if we could eventually find a way to forgive each other and move forward, because our friendship had meant something real, even though it was built on deception. I read the letter once, sitting in my Portland apartment with morning coffee. I felt nothing but a hollow kind of satisfaction. The letter was self-justification dressed up in the language of remorse, trying to rewrite history so that Natalie could see herself as a victim of circumstances rather than an active participant in destroying another person's life. She wanted absolution I wasn't willing to give. I filed the letter away in a folder with other evidence of betrayal and never responded. Some relationships can't be repaired and shouldn't be attempted. Forgiveness isn't something you owe to people who systematically destroyed your life just because they later regret getting caught. The civil lawsuit against Meridian Pharmaceuticals took another 2 years to resolve. The company fought aggressively, deploying teams of lawyers to challenge every claim. But eventually, facing the weight of evidence that had already resulted in criminal convictions for their executives, they settled. The terms require Meridian to pay $2.7 billion to patients harmed by their fraudulent drug approvals. They had to fund independent safety reviews of every medication they brought to market in the past decade. They were placed under federal monitoring for 15 years, with regulators embedded in their approval processes to prevent future fraud. My mother's estate received $12 million in wrongful death damages. I inherited it as her only living relative, and I donated every dollar to organizations that advocate for pharmaceutical safety and transparency. The money felt tainted, earned through my mother's murder, and I already had enough resources from Helen's Trust to live comfortably without it. Instead, I used part of Helen's Trust to start the Vaughn Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to investigating pharmaceutical fraud and supporting whistleblowers who risk their careers to expose corporate misconduct. We hired investigators, funded legal defenses, published reports that made pharmaceutical companies uncomfortable, shining light into corners where they preferred darkness. The foundation became my full-time work, my way of channeling grief and anger into something productive, something that would have made my mother and Helen proud, something that turned their deaths into a legacy that actually helped people instead of just being tragic endings to lives cut short by greed. I still think about room 14 at the Crossroads Motel sometimes, about sitting on that sagging bed, eating instant ramen with a plastic fork, wondering if I'd ever climb out of the hole my life had become. I keep the receipt from my last week there in my wallet, a reminder that rock bottom is real. That humiliation and betrayal can strip away everything you thought defined you, but they can't actually destroy you unless you let them. Helen had understood that. She'd spent her final years building a case and assembling resources because she believed truth mattered more than comfort and justice mattered more than safety. She'd been right. The paranoid, and everyone dismissed, had been the only one who understood how the world actually worked, who recognized that powerful people don't stop being corrupt just because you trust them or play by rules they ignore. The final truth Helen left me proved prophetic in ways I'm still discovering. Fighting doesn't always lead to winning, but not fighting guarantees losing. I built a meaningful life from the ruins of a fraudulent one. Messy, complicated, and fundamentally honest. The kind of ending my mother and Helen would have appreciated. The kind of story that reminds people that patience and documentation can topple empires built on lies. And that sometimes the greatest revenge is simply refusing to let corrupt people erase you from the narrative they've constructed around their own importance. I'm not the woman I was when I found that suitcase under the motel bed. I'm stronger than she was, more careful about trust, but also more certain about what matters. That woman didn't understand how much she could survive or how powerful she could become when everything else had been stripped away. I'm grateful I'm not her anymore. This journey, it changed everything for me. But I'm curious, after hearing my story, what would you have done if you found that suitcase? Or if your entire life turned out to be a carefully constructed lie? Tell me what you think in the comments below. I really want to know.